I first ran into Arigo in 1962, and it was absolutely astounding, but I couldn't believe my eyes as I watched it. I'm trained as a medical man. He violated every principle of surgery, okay? I mean, it was unbelievable. And everybody worshipped the guy. I mean, he was, a legend. And my experience with him was if there ever was a Christ-like figure on earth, he was it. I mean,
the tale of Brazilian surgeon Arigo is probably the most incredible story you'll ever hear. Arigo was a Brazilian peasant who was maybe the greatest doctor to ever live. He was a third-grade dropout, had no medical training at all, and never used anesthesia or sterilization in his surgeries. His only equipment was typically a dull, rusty knife, but despite this, he could cure virtually any illness. He would diagnose people at a glance and perform complex surgeries like removing cancerous tumors in under a minute. He would treat people with terminal diseases given only weeks to live and cure them instantly. Unbelievably, many claimed Arigo could stop a patient's bleeding with only a verbal command. Arigo claimed he could perform these miracles because he could channel the spirit of a deceased German doctor named Fritz. When he was possessed by this spirit, he had supernatural healing powers. Every day, sick and diseased people would line up by the thousands at the dilapidated shack Arigo worked from. Now, Arigo was a major celebrity in Brazil, but he was mostly unknown to the Western world until American scientists Henry Puharich and Henry Belk heard the incredible tales of Arigo's work. Disbelieving, they visited Cangaças de Campo, Arigo's small hometown in Brazil, to witness Arigo for themselves. The two Americans were absolutely amazed when they witnessed Arigo operating on patients. This passage from the book Arigo, Surgeon of the Rusty Knife describes what they saw. Arigo picked up a 4-inch paring knife and literally plunged it into a man's left eye, deep into the eye socket. Arigo began violently scraping the knife between the ocular globe and the inside of the lid, pressing up into the sinus area with uninhibited force. The man was wide awake, fully conscious, had been given no anesthesia, and showed no fear whatsoever. He did not move or flinch. A woman in the background screamed, another fainted. Arigo levered the eye so that it extruded from the socket. Arigo then withdrew the paring knife from the eye, bringing it out with a smear of pus on the point, and dismissed the patient. "You will be well, my friend," he said. Then he called his next patient. The entire examination had lasted less than a minute. The Americans were completely floored. They stayed at Arigo's small hospital all morning, watching in amazement as he treated people as if he was running an assembly line. He saw hundreds of patients, never using anesthesia, never sterilizing his knife, each treatment lasting no longer than a minute or two. Henry Puharich was so in awe of what he witnessed that he decided to let Arigo remove a benign tumor on the inside of his arm. Puharich described the bizarre events of the surgery years later.
So I said, I got a little fat tumor here on my arm. I said, would you mind just cutting it out? He said, sure. He grabbed my arm and he said, you can look at it. I said, no, I think I'll watch the cameraman. I'm trying to give him signals what to do. And so I turned my head briefly to tell the guy, do this, do that. And I looked down and there's a bleeding hole there and there's a fat tumor in my hand about this size. And I said, geez, I got gypped. No pain. I didn't feel any pain. I expected pain, right?
One of the most striking things about Arigo was just how widespread his popularity was. Everyone in Brazil at the time knew him. It said he was the second biggest celebrity in all of Brazil. Only the legendary soccer star Pele was more famous. A lot of times faith healers are these clandestine things that are whispered about or rumored about, but that was not the case with Arigo at all. Newspapers constantly featured him on the front page, and television broadcasts frequently interrupted programs with special news bulletins on Arigo. He treated Brazilian senators, medical professionals, and celebrities. Roberto Carlos was the biggest singer in Brazil, even more popular than the Beatles. In the 1960s, his son was born with a serious fulminant glaucoma, a condition that left him blind. After being told his son's condition was incurable by some of the best doctors in Europe, Carlos brought his son to Arigo. Arigo operated on him and his sight was restored. Carlos mentioned this miracle during sold-out concerts, bringing even more attention to Arigo. The beloved president of Brazil, Juscelino Kubitschek, also had Arigo treat his daughter. And Kubitschek's case is interesting because he himself was a renowned surgeon before he was elected president. He became good friends with Arigo and he would occasionally stop by his hospital, and his interactions with Arigo left him absolutely awestruck. I knew about his fantastic prestige from the many prominent people who told me what Arigo had done for them, Kubitschek said. But being a physician and surgeon myself, I found him so extraordinary that I cannot find words to express it. The people had faith in him. No one could fail to do so. He was a god. It was common for Arigo to write off prescriptions for sick people instead of performing surgery. He would typically glance at a patient and write these prescriptions a second or two afterwards. He didn't perform any examination or testing at all, and often the combination of drugs he prescribed made no sense to traditional doctors. But they worked, and many claimed that the medicines and drugs Arigo prescribed would only work when he prescribed them. If other doctors wrote the same prescription, it had no effect. It was as if Arigo had some sort of magic touch. Arigo's ability to look at a patient and rapidly scrawl down a medication for them fascinated Puharich and Belk.
Childhood leukemia, you could literally cure 100% with drugs that just didn't make any sense, so we knew something else was going on.
On a return visit, they asked Arigo how he was able to write these prescriptions. "How are you able to know modern medical terminology in such detail if you haven't studied it?" Puharich asked Arigo. Arigo laughed and replied through an interpreter. "That's the easiest thing to do. I just listen to what the voice tells me and I repeat it." "What voice are you talking about?" "It's the voice of Dr. Fritz. I always hear it in my left ear." "Do you understand the medical words?" Puharich asked. "No, I just repeat what I hear." The essence of Arigo's skills and powers came from his possession by the spirit of Dr. Fritz. Now, spirit possession is a very controversial topic in the Western world, but the people of Brazil are different. Many of them accept paraphysical happenings like spirit possessions as basic realities. The paraphysical is simply a part of their culture. Many Brazilians of all walks, rich, poor, educated, uneducated, follow Kardechism, a philosophy that believes in the spirit world and in communication with it. And Kardechism was especially popular during Arigo's time in the mid-20th century. Powerful spirits are all around us, this philosophy claims, both good and bad spirits, and mediums who are carefully trained can communicate with this spirit world and even have these spirits take over their body, which is what Arigo claimed happened with him and Dr. Fritz. Despite the incredible stories being told about Arigo and the tens of thousands of people who'd been treated by him, there were some people who claimed Arigo was a fraud. But if he was a fraud, he wasn't a very profitable one. Arigo never once accepted money from anyone he operated on. He claimed Dr. Fritz would abandon him and he would lose his powers if he profited from them in any way. As beloved as Arigo was by the Brazilian people, he had enemies too. A group of local doctors tried to prosecute Arigo for practicing medicine without a license, and they actually succeeded for a while. He was locked up in jail, but when residents started protesting, he was released. Arigo's enemies continued to try and prove that he was a fraud. They hired Dr. Ari Lex, a surgeon who was known for exposing frauds in the medical practice, to observe Arigo and gather evidence that he was deceiving people. Dr. Lex observed Arigo treat over 30 patients, and one was for a trigium, a growth that was locked onto a patient's cornea. Dr. Lex watched in disbelief as Arigo picked up a pair of unsterilized nail scissors and directly cut into the patient's eyeball with unbelievable roughness. When blood began pouring down the patient's cheek, Dr. Lex claimed Arigo looked to the ceiling. "Jesus does not want you to bleed," he said, ordering the blood to stop. And all of a sudden, the bleeding stopped altogether. Instead of finding evidence that Arigo was a fraud, Dr. Lex was left stunned. "The only possible adjectives I can find to define this are spectacular and astounding," he said. And this is another interesting thing about Arigo. He was willing to meet with any and all people who tried to debunk his work, and he even agreed to subject himself to scientific testing. He wasn't hiding anything at all. Dr. Puharich would occasionally bring medical colleagues from America to observe Arigo, and these skeptical colleagues became convinced that Arigo was legitimate.
We began to believe, and I'm talking about really very fine doctors from Johns Hopkins and NYU where I was, and Harvard and so on, and this guy is real, but we didn't know how it worked.
Arigo underwent testing with the Americans once, and a second, more extensive round of testing was planned. But before it happened, tragedy struck. Around this time, Arigo began telling friends of a black crucifix that started appearing in his dreams. He told them he feared it was a sign of his impending death. Brazilian President Kubitschek visited his friend Arigo in early 1970. "I am sure I will die violently very soon," Arigo said to him, "so I say goodbye to you with sadness. This is the last time we will ever meet." Arigo mentioned the black crucifixes to another friend. "I'm afraid my mission on Earth is finished," he said. And he was right. On January 11, 1971, Arigo was killed in a violent car crash. The official story was that he suffered a coronary while driving and lost control, crashing head-on into a pickup truck. His death was front-page news around the country, and it was estimated that over 20,000 people visited his casket to pay their respects. And there may be more to the story. Years later, Dr. Puharich told of a bizarre event that happened to him when Arigo died.
And the very strange part of the story is I got a call from Brazil, a call from New York, from some press, allegedly, people, and they said, "Have you heard that Arigo died?" And I said, "No, I'm absolutely shocked." They said, "Do you have any comment?" I said, "No, I'm in a state of shock. Let me call you back. Give me your number." They gave me the number. I called up the Brazilian consulate whom I knew. I called up Rio. Nobody had any record of his being dead. And a person like that, the news would go around the world. Make a long story short, the actual fact is I got that call an hour before he died, you know, checking out the time. And secondly, when I tried to call this mysterious party, there was no such party, there was no such telephone number, it was like zilch. So that alone was very, very spooky.
A few years after Arigo's death, author John Fuller began researching Arigo and spoke with many about the feats that Arigo performed. Arigo and his work will make you very confused, one expert on the afterlife told him, unless you understand the basic belief under it all, that reincarnation is a fact. Human beings are creatures that shed lives as they shed clothes. She told Fuller that after death, the essence of the person still exists, just not in human form. Many would call this the soul, and these souls exist all around us in a world that's invisible to our naked eye. Communication with this world is possible through training and practice, and these souls can take over a person's body if the conditions are right. And if you believe that, the phenomenon of Arigo starts to make a little more sense. He was simply a man in touch with the spirit world. You may not believe in it, but there are millions in the world who do.